Welcome, everyone, to Fantasy Foresight, the podcast. We're your hosts and co-founders of FantasyForesight.com, coming to you from the Rambo Fixture Company studios. I'm Ben.
And I'm Jay.
You ready to get rolling, Jay?
You know it. Let's do this.
All right, let's go. Welcome in, everyone. It is Sunday, September 27th. We've got our guy, Steve, at FF_Encyclopedia back with us. We've got a whole new list of week 3 buys and sells, plus Steve's speculative stashes, including our Stash and Dash Sunday strategy. So it's going to be a fun one. And once again, Fantasy Foresight, the podcast, is live. How you doing today, Jay?
Ben, it's week 3. It's redemption week. Week 2 was crazy, as we discussed on our last pod. Week 3 can't possibly be the same way, can it, Steve?
I certainly hope not, because there just might not be enough players left for all of us to put rosters out to play with.
Amen.
So, I don't think it could be any worse. And of course, being a Browns fan, already got the nerves shaking a little bit heading into this one. I think it's going to be a little bit of a struggle for us. But hey, it's Sunday. We got fantasy football. I'm just happy to be on with you guys. Thank you, as always.
Amen.
Yes, sir. It's a big week 3. Like you said, Steve, that's the Browns. It's fantasy football. It's these buys and sells, man. There's just something in the air. It's going to be a big day today. Quick disclaimer. If this is your first time listening, just know that we're speaking in terms of single QB, full PPR redraft by default. And all of our fantasy finishes, as well as fantasy points per game calculations, are all based on full PPR limited to weeks 1 through 16, according to fantasypros.com. All right, let's get right into what we expect to be a marquee accuracy week on this podcast, and it starts with our first buy of the week, and I'm talking about Tennessee Titans quarterback Ryan Tannehill. The Titans are at Minnesota at 1 p.m., 3-point favorite at Vegas. Over-under is a nice 49.5. They're in the dome, so the weather doesn't matter, and he is currently aggregate projected QB 17. Total Foresight is buying that with a rank of QB 14, and he sits in with the 9th best quarterback strength of schedule at FantasyForesight.com this week. And when you take a look at their O-line, they have just given up 2 sacks this season. That is tied for 4th fewest allowed, and Derrick Henry is averaging 100-plus rush yards per game. And when you look at their opposing defense, in 2 games, Minnesota has just 1 sack, 5 QB hits, 1 interception, and 2 forced fumbles. In week 1, A-Rod torched Minnesota. In week 2, Rivers sucked versus them, as he typically does nowadays. In week 3, Tannehill will look a bit more like A-Rod and a lot less like Rivers versus that Vikings defense. Tannehill is currently 2nd in pass touchdowns. He's thrown 0 interceptions. He's 10th in completion percentage at 70+%. He's doing all this without A.J. Brown, and he's currently the 11th most consistent quarterback in football. And remember, he was QB2 in that metric last season, so this is nothing new. If you're not believing in Ryan Tannehill still at this point, catch up. So versus an aggregate projection of QB 17, I am absolutely buying Tannehill this week.
I got to tell you, we made a lot of it after the last season in our review podcast about how great Ryan Tannehill was, and we questioned whether or not he could do it again in a full season, coming in as the starter. And he's doing it. He's looking fantastic, throwing the ball. Vrabel's putting him in a great position to be successful, as we should have expected. And yeah, man, that Minnesota defense, that Minnesota team in general just looks like a mess right now. Like you said, they're in a dome. He's spreading the ball around. All he has to do is beat QB 17, and I am going to go with the odds and say he beats that as well. So I'm going to buy Ryan Tannehill.
Yeah, like you guys both said, he's looked fantastic so far this season, and kudos to him, because I was definitely one of those people in the camp of I need to see a little bit more out of him, as far as buying into Ryan Tannehill, and he hasn't disappointed. And yeah, the aggregate projection of QB 17, yeah, I'm going to buy that he finishes much better than that this week. I think a lot of people, the only concern would be, well, if Derrick Henry has a dominant game, but I don't know if you guys have noticed, but Derrick Henry's struggling so far this season. I mean, he's getting the yardage, he's been in the end zone, but I mean, it's coming off of an enormous amount of carries that is not sustainable throughout an NFL season. So, that's just something interesting to kind of,
I wonder if maybe when A.J. Brown comes back, that'll help free him up a little bit and put some more pressure on the secondary to maybe not load boxes. I'd be interested to see what those percentages look like right now.
True. And to that point, Steve, this is Darrington Evans' first week being active. So I don't know if you have him on your spec stash list, but somebody to also keep in mind this week, just in case anything does happen to DH. Now there's all of a sudden a workhorse back up there. Moving on to our next buy of the week. You know what? We're going to do 2 in a row. I'm taking the entire remaining San Francisco 49ers backfield. Total Foresight that is. And the 49ers are at the Giants Sunday at 1 p.m., 3.5 point favorite with an over under 42.5. Raheem Mostert, the beast, is out. The weather is clear in 78, so that will not be a factor. Jerick McKinnon is coming in with an aggregate projection of RB 41, and Total Foresight is buying that with a current rank of RB 20. Jeff Wilson Jr., his aggregate projection is RB 77. Total Foresight is buying that with a rank of RB 69. Both of them have the 8th best running back strength of schedule. And when you look at their O-line, the yards per carry average for their primary running back so far is nasty. 6.4 and 16.8 yards per carry, respectively. And when you look at the Giants defense, the New York Giants gave up 113 rush yards and a TD to Benny Snell in week 1 and 127 yards and a TD to David Montgomery in week 2. And then I'm with Total Foresight once again when it comes to both these guys. McKinnon is a buy for me because he has finished far better than his aggregate projection in each of his first 2 weeks, to the point that he's the 17th most consistent running back in fantasy currently, finishing as a back-end RB2 in both week 1 and week 2. And he's done all this on just 9 total touches. With Mostert out and an expected uptick to McKinnon's opportunities, RB 41 versus this defense should be very attainable. And when it comes to Jeff Wilson Jr., on Wednesday at rotoworld.com, it was reported that the San Francisco Chronicle believes that Jeff Wilson, quote, could see the most action in week 3. That quote alone is enough for me to buy Jeff Wilson versus a measly aggregate projection of RB 77. And remember, when pushed to the forefront of this backfield at the end of 2018, he finished as PPR running back 8 in week 13 and running back 28 in week 14. With the same opportunity this week, beating an aggregate projection of RB 77 should be a breeze versus this porous Giants defense.
And it's all about that aggregate projection this week, fellas. A team that loves to run the ball going up against a defense that has struggled at times so far already this season. And like you said, Ben, Jerick McKinnon may just continue his complementary role to Jeff Wilson taking over the load. And either way, Jerick McKinnon has been getting a lot of the goal line work and those end zone opportunities, and he's been cashing in so far this season, which has made him very fantasy relevant. And I don't see any reason why that won't continue this week. So yeah, you know what? With those aggregate projections of RB 41 and RB 77, I hate to keep agreeing with Total Foresight and with everybody, but I like the odds, and I think they're both going to beat those projections.
And like you said, Jay, it's really just all about those projections. And how can you not buy for both of these guys? You know, like you said, it's a little boring, but I don't want to go against the grain just for the sake of going against the grain on these ones. And you know, the defensive matchup, sure, you can attack the Giants through the air as well. But right now, that's really not probably the strongest way for San Francisco to go about attacking anybody right now. You know, they got their backup quarterback. They don't have any receiving options. So it's just like –
and no Kittle either.
Exactly.
Right.
So, you know, it's like, hey, give the ball to these two guys, grind it out, get the W that you need, and move on. And there'll be plenty for both of these guys to eat and have a decent fantasy day, no doubt.
And just real quick on San Francisco, you know, I've wanted to buy in on their wide receivers just because of all the injuries they had, but really so far they haven't really produced. It's been all out of the backfield. It's that running attack and passing out of the backfield that's really been dangerous in the fantasy world. So I'm going to continue to buy in until I see otherwise.
And that's what it is, Jay. You guys have both said it. It's a combination of not only the aggregate projections, but this specific Kyle Shanahan offense in the way he schemes his running backs into such quality touches that the yards per carry is 6 and 16.
Yeah.
You know, obviously that could come back to earth a little bit as the season wears on, but it's that Giants defense. Like we said, week 2, Benny Snell was on a milk carton, and week 1, he went over 100 yards, and it was against this defense. And then David Montgomery, how's he been looking? He's been a little ouchy. We're not sure but balled out against this team. Yeah. So it's all there for him. Yeah. And when we put these lists of buys and sells together on this podcast, we do everything we can to avoid repeat after repeat after repeat and try to bring you a variety. I'm making an exception in week 3. We need to have a talk once again about Allen freaking Robinson. Chicago Bears wide receivers on the road at Atlanta today at 1 p.m. Atlanta's a 3-point favorite with a very nice over-under of 47.5. Obviously, they're in that dome. Weather is not a concern. Wide receiver 33 is now the aggregate projection for A-Rob. Total Foresight is buying that, currently has him in as wide receiver 18. Foresight strength of schedule clocks him in with the fourth best at the wide receiver position. And the O-line in Chicago has given up 5 sacks. That's tied for 10th most allowed, despite allowing Mitch the 5th most time to throw. But good news, when you look at this Atlanta defense, they have allowed 38 points to Seattle in week 1 and 40 points to Dallas in week 2. A-Rob is tied for 10th in targets with 18, 9 in each game so far. Even Mitch Trubisky can be competent versus this defense. And if Mitch is decent or better, then A-Rob will absolutely shine. I thought an aggregate projection of wide receiver 30 was disrespectful in week 2. And now in week 3, we're talking about walking backwards and an aggregate projection of wide receiver 33. Mitch or no Mitch, A-Rob is that good, and I'll buy him to meet or exceed a back-end wide receiver 3 every single time.
All right, so he was wide receiver 30 in aggregate projections last week and finished wide receiver 78 and burned us last week. And this week he's going up against a porous Atlanta Falcons defense. The only problem I have, though, Ben, is that you mentioned it, that Seattle put up so many points and Dallas put up so many points. The difference being they have Russell Wilson and Dak Prescott behind center in those offenses. And now you're asking me to trust Mitch Trubisky, and you all know how I feel about my boy Mitch. It's not about Allen Robinson in this case. It's about the guy getting him the ball, and can he do it enough for Allen Robinson to beat WR33? Like Steve said, I don't want to go against the grain just to go against the grain. I want to be correct, and Allen Robinson did burn us last week, and we blamed it more on Mitch. So you're asking me to turn around and trust Mitch this week? I'm going to go against the grain and sell Allen Robinson this week, and I'm not going to be a believer in Mitch, and he's going to burn me this week, and that's fine.
Hey, can't blame you for that necessarily. It's sound logic to avoid Mitchell Trubisky.
Bring in Nick Foles.
But, I'm going to go ahead and buy, though, for a couple of reasons. As we mentioned, the matchup, right? Yeah. It's Atlanta. You figure at least Atlanta, they can put some points on the board, make this, more of an air it out game than trying to run David Montgomery as often. And then, I just think additionally, it's just almost for me like playing a numbers game. Like, how many weeks can we realistically go without Allen Robinson finishing in the wide receiver 3 range? So I feel like wide receiver 33, if there's going to be a week to do it, at least this is a matchup that's conducive to him getting the targets and finding himself, against a soft defense where he can put up the numbers to exceed that. So I'll go ahead and buy, but of course, Mitch needs to land a few balls or he can catch them.
Don't you think it's a little bit odd, though, that Vegas has the over-under on this game lower than the Minnesota-Tennessee game? It's a little eyebrow-raising.
I don't know. I mean, Atlanta's offense is explosive and their defense is equally bad. Like, I get it. It is Mitch Trubisky, and I don't expect 38 or 40 points like the Seahawks and the Cowboys have mustered against them. But because it is this defense, Mitch ought to be able to muster 21 to 24. And if they do that, I think it's going to have to involve Allen Robinson to an extent far more involved than wide receiver 33. So, I'm with you, man. I'm very fatigued on Mitch Trubisky. I'm very fatigued on Allen Robinson not having a stud quarterback to throw him the football. And unless unless Chicago does something very definitive with their quarterback position, I just hope he doesn't sign. Free A-Rob, man. Let's go.
Free A-Rob, man. He is like Mike Evans. Never had a good quarterback to throw him the ball in his entire career.
Right. And now, thankfully, one of the few consistent, beautiful, bright spots of this fantasy football season is a very nice, rapid ascent and like a promotion on this podcast from speculative stash to waiver ad to now buy of the week. We're talking about Atlanta Falcons quarterback Russell Gage. The same game as what we were just talking about, 1 p.m. home versus Chicago, 3-point favorite, 47.5 point over under. And his aggregate projection, Russell Gage, is wide receiver 36. Total Foresight is buying that because they have them at wide receiver 31. And at fantasyforesight.com, our Foresight strength of schedule gives the Falcons wide receivers the second best strength of schedule this week. Their O-line has given up 3 sacks. That's tied for 13th fewest, and they've given Matty Ice the eighth most time to throw. And when you look at the opposing defense at Chicago, Danny Amendola and a gimpy Golden Tate combined for 10 receptions and 128 yards versus this Chicago D in weeks 1 and week 2. Neither of those guys are half the talent of Russell Gage at this point in their respective careers, and neither of them have Matty Ice throwing them the ball. Currently, Russell Gage is, check this out and listen closely, Russell Gage is 13th in receiving yards. Russell Gage is 8th in targets. He is tied for 6th in receptions, and he's wide receiver 11 overall through 2 weeks. And through 2 weeks, he's been the 8th most consistent wide receiver in football. Now, with Julio limited, and especially if he's out, no one, not even Calvin Ridley, will benefit more than Russell Gage, because if Julio sits, now Ridley becomes the defensive focal point while Gage will still be running free. Mark it down. Gage is as nice of a wide receiver 3 as anyone out there right now, and technically, he's currently a fantasy wide receiver 1, currently sitting at wide receiver 11. So versus an aggregate projection of wide receiver 36, yeah, this buy is the lock of the week in my opinion. I am all in on Russell Gage.
You know what? We've seen some opportunities for guys who have played second fiddle to somebody else in their offense be able to step up and be the WR1, and it hasn't really worked out so far this season. You know, we've been burned a couple times by guys all of a sudden having the top DB cover them, but this is different. Russell Gage won't have to move up and be the number 1 receiver on that offense. Calvin Ridley will. So I could see maybe potentially a dip for Ridley not living up to expectation. But I love Russell Gage's point in this offense now because he's still not going to get the top corner defending him. He's still going to be able to feast against that defense. And really, Chicago's pass rush is what's notable about that defense. So that'll be a nice matchup to watch. But that secondary certainly can be attacked still. So yeah, against an aggregate projection of wide receiver 36, I'm all in on Russell Gage.
Oh man, I know it's boring, but and Ben, you know we texted a little bit about this one. You know where I'm headed, but definitely going to buy. Russell Gage is, he's like one of my guys.
Yeah,
I root for him, and think he's definitely underrated. And yeah, just for all the reasons you guys already laid out for the listeners. This is a buy all the way. It's a pretty easy one in my opinion.
Love it. There's been a lot of unnecessary surprises and disappointments, to say the least, in this fantasy football season. And it's just been very nice to watch, like you said, Steve, almost like a homegrown guy on this podcast, and like a marquee guy at Fantasy Foresight this whole offseason for sure. And moving on to our next buy of the week, we've got another wide receiver for you. And we're talking about New Orleans Saints wide receiver Traquan Smith. He is at home versus Green Bay on Sunday Night Football. The Saints are a 3-point favorite, and there is a nice over under of 53 points. They're in the Superdome, and his aggregate projection is wide receiver 64. Total Foresight is buying that. I'm surprised about how slightly Total Foresight's buying that, with a Total Foresight rank of wide receiver 62. The Saints wide receivers have the 17th ranked strength of schedule this week, and that O-line has been elite. They've given up just 1 sack, which is second fewest in the league. In Green Bay, the opposing defense has allowed Adam Thielen to go 6 for 110 and 2 touchdowns in week 1 1 and gave up 2 pass touchdowns to the ragtag bunch of the Kenny G-less wide receivers in Detroit in week 2. It's pretty well documented at this point that Drew Brees called for Traquan Smith to break out this year in the offseason. And with Michael Thomas still being unavailable, he was clearly the wide receiver with the most chemistry with Brees in week 2, finishing as wide receiver 29. Since nothing has really changed for him this week, it's pretty easy to buy Traquan Smith versus an aggregate projection of just wide receiver 64.
Yeah, I'm with you, for a couple of reasons. One, I'm a little concerned just because so much was made of Drew Brees last week and the way his arm looked. But with the passing volume we should expect against a defense where the Packers did not address wide receiver in the offseason and they did not address that defense in the offseason, and we've seen that through the first 2 weeks, even though they've been able to pick up wins, I expect some points to be scored. Even if New Orleans falls behind early and they have to play catch up, I think game script, no matter what, plays into the hands of Traquan Smith. Somebody's going to have to catch balls. It could be Jared Cook in the red zone, but moving the ball otherwise, I expect big weeks from Alvin Kamara. And then Traquan Smith against an aggregate projection of wide receiver 64. I mean, how can I bet against that? So I got to be a buy here just because of the odds.
I have to be honest, guys. I've been struggling quite a bit with this one.
Yeah.
And some of it's just that, man, Drew Brees, he doesn't seem to throw the ball downfield too much, but they were able to manufacture targets for this guy last week. So, just talking through it aloud and based on what you guys were saying, yeah, I think, again, I know it's boring, but wide receiver 64, and he really is the best option they have to throw the ball to.
Steve, yeah.
Outside of Alvin Kamara, I mean, Jared Cook certainly is a red zone target, but as far as anyone who has some true playmaking ability, and that's no knock on Manny Sanders, just He is what he is at this point in his career. So, I'm going to bet on him getting that one home run ball, or, even if he finds his way to 5 grabs for 56 yards, he's going to be able to outpace that wide receiver 64 mark.
And that's it right there, Steve. He doesn't even have to have a home run ball. All he has to do is exactly what he did last week. And his situation is exactly the same, except I would call A-Raj, even without Devontae Adams, more explosive than the Raiders offense. So Vegas has still got the over-under at 53 for a reason. Devontae Adams is a game-time decision, but you know how I feel about game-time decision, guys. It comes down to wide receiver 64. And I think that's why we have total consensus on here. And again, if you were looking for us to argue and yell at each other today, I apologize. I only care about one thing this week, and that's accuracy. And the fellas, the guys disagree with me when they disagree with me. Amen. And there are certain times when we all agree. And when we all agree, as much as we enjoy yelling at each other, it might tell you something. So moving on to our next buy of the week, we're moving on to a couple of tight ends. First up, our guy Russ is going to like this one. Tennessee Titans tight end Jonnu Smith. The Titans are on the road at Minnesota Sunday at 1 p.m. today. They're a 3-point favorite with an over-under of 49.5. The aggregate projection for Jonnu is tight end 14. Total Foresight is emphatically buying that with a current rank of tight end 6. Jonnu has the 10th best strength of schedule this week, and the O-line in Tennessee has given up just 2 sacks, which is tied for 4th fewest allowed. And when you look at that opposing defense, Minnesota, Mo Alley Cox just torched them from the tight end position last week, 5 receptions for 111 yards. And with A.J. Brown out in week 2, Jonnu went 4 for 84 and 2 touchdowns. In week 1, Jonnu had yet another touchdown and will be a primary red zone target in that offense all season long. There's no reason he's not projected as an every week tight end 1. Easy buy for me versus tight end 14 this week.
Yeah, I'm with you. It's all about the aggregate projection every time we do this. And for all the reasons you mentioned, I think that defense certainly will give up some yardage to the tight end position. We talked about how we expect Ryan Tannehill to have a good week this week. And with A.J. Brown still out, you have Corey Davis there to catch balls, but they're not going to throw a ton out of the backfield. So somebody's got to catch those passes. And I would imagine Jonnu Smith, this is going to be one of those games where you see the highlight of a big play from Jonnu Smith. And really, just one of those big plays should get him in the top 14 at the tight end position. So, yep, I'm all in on it as a buy as well. As boring as it is, I'm with Total Foresight so far.
Love it.
I mean, Yeah, guys, tight end 14. The thing is, we know that at the tight end position in fantasy, there can be a lot of, variable performances week to week. Like, a guy being a tight end one every single week, it doesn't happen. But you look at the matchup, you look at the fact that AJ Brown's out, and Jonnu, quite frankly, is on fire so far this season.
Yeah.
They'll find a way to manufacture targets for him because they do that. And, tight end 14. I feel like stupid if I were to sell it, so I have to buy.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's like I'm very okay being wrong about this one because there's so many reasons to buy in. And another guy Steve has talked about in our speculative stash and waiver wire ad series on other episodes of this podcast, our last buy of week 3 is Cincinnati Bengals tight end Drew Sample. The Bengals are on the road at Philadelphia at 1:00 today. Philly is, for some reason, somehow, a 4-point favorite with an over under of 47. The weather is clear and 80 degrees, so that's not going to be a factor. Aggregate projection for Drew Sample is just tight end 34. Total Foresight is buying that only slightly because there's a very small sample size. It has him in at tight end 32, but I expect him to well outpace that. That O-line in Cincy has given up 6 sacks. That's tied for 5th most allowed in the NFL. And versus that opposing Philadelphia defense, Washington's tight end Logan Thomas saw 9 targets in week 1. And in week 2, Philly gave up 5 receptions for 54 yards and 3 touchdowns to Tyler Higbee. Through 2 weeks, Cincinnati tight ends CJ Uzomah and Drew Sample have combined for, get this, 21 targets, 16 receptions, 139 yards, and 1 touchdown. If all those targets went to the same tight end, that'd be behind only Darren Waller's 24. So forget streamer worthy. This guy could develop into an every week option with that type of volume. And apparently, unless your name is OJ Howard, it will never be hard for Drew Sample to beat an aggregate projection of tight end 34. I'm buying.
You know what? If you're playing DFS this week, Drew Sample might be one of those steals. Guys always jump up and surprise, and you try to pick who those guys are going to be. And this week, it very well could be Drew Sample. I, for one, just can't wait to see how much and how quickly Philly falls behind in this game. It's going to be really fun to watch.
When you watch these two teams, I have no idea why Philly has looked awful in 2 weeks. Cincinnati, with a young rookie quarterback making a lot of rookie type mistakes, has been very much in both of their football games against the Chargers and the Browns on the road. So all of a sudden you go to Philly, if they keep looking at how they've been looking, and since he keeps looking how they've been looking, since he's going to win this game.
I'll tell you, dude, I'm right there with you. They drove and won game week 1 and just got it negated by a bad penalty call. In week 2, they were within a touchdown and kept that game closer than it probably should have been. So against that Philly defense that has really been porous and disappointing, and that Philly offense is still a mess, still can't get healthy. So, I would take Cincy in the points, but 2, Drew Sample against an aggregate projection of tight end 34. Dude, I'm buying that all day long.
And I think when I talked about Sample, what was it on? Tuesday night. Yeah. I admittingly hadn't had the opportunity to go back and watch him play, for what he did in the fourth quarter of the Thursday night game. And then watching that, it's he and Burrow definitely, they look good together. He looks good. He was a 2nd round pick, so the fact that, Uzomah's out and the Bengals have 21% of their targets have gone to tight ends, and there's been a lot of targets in Cincinnati. So the fact that it's just going to be one guy that can soak all of that up now in PPR leagues, I mean, like you said, Ben, this week, because of the matchup, if you needed to stream a tight end, he's only rostered in 3% of leagues. Go get him and do that. Kittle's out, and if you don't feel good about Jordan Reed, then hey, why not? And you mentioned some of their combined production, CJ and Drew, but that also would equate to tight end 5 in PPR leagues thus far in the season. So, you guys know I'm buying this one. definitely.
Yep, absolutely. And now we have several. How many do we have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cells for you this week. And so that's 8 buys, 6 cells. And the first one this week is a little surprising, maybe. Minnesota Vikings running back Dalvin Cook. The Vikings are at home versus Tennessee Sunday today at 1 p.m. Like we said, the Titans are a 3-point favorite with an over-under of 49.5. And, the current aggregate projection for Dalvin Cook is RB3. Total Foresight is selling that from the standpoint that, we have him listed as RB7, more of like a middle of the road. And I'm honestly expecting more of a back end RB1 this week. So you just need to make all of your, wide receiver 3, your tight end streamer, your quarterback streamer, your flex, whatever. Make your decisions accordingly with managed expectations about what you expect to get from every single player on your offense this week. And RB3, that's a lot. So just keep that in mind. The Vikings running backs have the 15th ranked running back strength of schedule, and their O-line has given up 5 sacks, which is tied for 10th most allowed. But Dalvin is averaging 4.3 yards per carry, and Madison is averaging 7. So the run game offensive blocking looks to be a little bit more effective than the pass game. And when you look at their opposing defense versus the Tennessee Titans run D, Melvin Gordon finished as RB14 in week 1, and James Robinson finished as RB9 in week 2. Dalvin had just 13 total touches in week 1 and 16 in week 2. He was RB8 in week 1 versus Green Bay and RB17 in week 2 at Indy. So I'm just struggling to understand what people are seeing to project an overall finish of RB3 for Dalvin this week. This is definitely a sell for me. And Dalvin's not going to get in the end zone every week like he has so far. And without 3 touchdowns, his fantasy weeks would look a lot different so far. And the Vikes aren't good this year, and I'll be shocked if they're not 0-3 after this week. It takes a lot for a guy to be RB3 overall, and I just don't see Dalvin being that dude this week. It's a sell for me.
And that's it, man. It's the price tag. Nobody's saying Dalvin Cook isn't going to be good. I mean, Total Foresight has him ranked as an RB7. That's still, a rock solid RB1, so you're obviously playing him, but his usage so far, they played a porous defense in Green Bay in week 1 and aired it out, and Adam Thielen had a monster game, and Dalvin Cook only touched the ball 13 times. And then week 2, they play a good defense in Indy, and he only touches the ball 16 times. So I don't like the usage so far out of Dalvin Cook. I thought, they'd rely on him a lot more, but really that team is just... They've struggled so far in football games, and when you're going up against a well-coached Tennessee team who knows how to muck up games and grind out wins, it may be closer, so maybe they'll rely more on the running game. But you mentioned it, Ben. James Robinson had a great game in week 2 and finished in as RB9, which is fantastic. But you're asking me, yes, you're asking me to bet RB3 or better. That's leaving 0 room for error. So I gotta bet against that, and I'm gonna sell and agree with Total Foresight.
And another agreement, but yeah.
I was like, are you gonna buy this, Steve?
No, I mean I can't. And I've said it before on this podcast. I have a real hard time wanting to buy most anybody when their aggregate projections that high, because it is so hard to finish that high at any position on a week-to-week basis. Unless you're Christian McCaffrey in 2019 or Todd Gurley in 2017 and 18, where you could almost bank on them flirting in the top 3 every single week. But Dalvin Cook, and in this Minnesota offense so far this season, I'm not going to bank on him flirting with the top 3 on any given week, even if it's a great matchup, because you just never know how that game's going to go. So yeah, I have to sell it, and sell it pretty hard actually.
No doubt. We might have a disagreement on this next one. We're going to have to see. Houston Texans running back David Johnson is our next sell this week. The Texans are on the road at Pittsburgh today at 1 p.m., and that's really going to be a running theme in this when we discuss David Johnson. Pittsburgh is currently a 4-point favorite with an over-under of 45.5. It's going to be clear in 82 today in Pittsburgh, so weather's going to be a non-factor. Thank you, Weather Channel app. And the aggregate projection for David Johnson is currently RB13. Total Foresight is selling that, not going crazy, still calling him a back end RB2, which is very respectful against this defense because Total Foresight has him as RB24. Total Foresight also has him coming in at the second worst running back strength of schedule. That offensive line in Houston has allowed the most sacks in the NFL. DJ has 5 yards per carry on the year, but just 3 yards per carry versus Baltimore in week 2. Do you remember? Okay, first off, when we're looking at Pittsburgh and as the opposing defense, do you remember week 1 and what that Pittsburgh D did to Saquon and that terrible Giants O-line? Total destruction. Now, Denver's run game fared a little better versus them in week 2, but in week 3, the Steelers D faces an O-line who's allowed the most sacks in football, like I said, and I expect any production DJ gets to be through the air because in week 1, while Saquon did have 60 receiving yards on 6 receptions, he only totaled 6 rush yards on 15 attempts. Overall, versus a similarly bad offensive line for the Giants, Pittsburgh's D had 11 tackles for loss, 3 sacks, 8 QB hits, and 2 interceptions in 1 game. Amidst that dominance, Saquon finished as RB23 in week 1, very close to where we have David Johnson ranked at Total Foresight at RB24. And DJ is no Saquon, so RB13 this week with that O-line on the road versus the Steelers. Who's not selling that?
God, the pressure this week on that offensive line is going to be unreal. And, the smart thing would be is to dump the ball over the top of that defensive pressure and kick it out to the running back and kind of try to relieve some of that pressure. But you're asking me to assume that Bill O'Brien is going to do the smart thing. And we saw in week 1 how he went out and surprised with his usage of David Johnson and used him the way, some of us didn't expect. Some of us thought he should, and he did. But then week 2 completely went away from it. Back to the Bill O'Brien of old. Didn't use David Johnson at all. Duke Johnson's still out this week. So, the primary ball carrier out of that backfield is going to be DJ once again. But again, you're asking me to trust Bill O'Brien, and I can't do it. I can't do it. I want David Johnson to do well. There's always surprise performances where you write somebody off because they're going up against a very tough defense, and somebody will turn in a surprise performance, maybe get in the end zone a time or two because they get a few goal line carries. So could DJ finish with like 38 total yards and 2 touchdowns and make it in? Sure. Am I going to bet that happens? Heck no. So I'm going to sell DJ as RB13. I can't do it. I want him to do better. I want him to, but I can't do it, man. And yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. The longer this episode has been going on, I'm looking through the list, and I'm like, I really want to disagree with these guys.
I know, man.
I want to. It's kind of, in my nature to want to have a couple of picks different than you guys. But a running back 13 against Pittsburgh on the road, the way that Houston's looked so far, the way that they've used David Johnson so far, in combination of weeks 1 and 2, like you said, Jay, the only way I see him finishing in that high end RB2, low end RB1 range is if he does punch in at least minimally a score, and he's got to get 4 or 5 catches out of the backfield and put up a decent yardage total.
Right.
And I just feel like that's just asking way too much, given all the other factors. It's like, what's more likely to happen? Him finishes a low end RB2 or a high end RB2, and I gotta go with low end RB2, if that. So I have to sell this one, just like everybody else.
every week there's always surprises, so who knows? But I can't bet on it.
Yeah, you just, like you said, it comes down, in the off season, it comes down to the ADP price tag. During the season, it comes down to the aggregate projections and managing your expectations. And when you're telling us to expect RB13 from David Johnson, we have to disagree with you wholeheartedly. Aggregate projections. So that's why we're not going to disagree just to disagree. I mean, the facts are the facts.
We're getting some criticism by our guy Doc. He wants us to disagree. Maybe it'll happen on our next pick.
We'll see, but I'm going to keep on trying to be right. We've got LA Rams wide receiver Robert Woods. The Rams are on the road at Buffalo today at 1 p.m. Buffalo is a 2-point favorite with an over-under of 46.5. It's clear in 82 there, so weather's not a factor there. The aggregate projection I was very surprised to see for Robert Woods this week is wide receiver 6. Total Foresight is selling only slightly, having him clocked in at wide receiver 7. He has the 15th ranked wide receiver strength of schedule. That O-line has given up just 2 sacks, which is tied for 4th fewest allowed. And the Bills D got torched by slot wide receiver Jamison Crowder to the tune of 7 for 115 and a touchdown in week 1. And in week 2, slot wide receiver Isaiah Ford went 7 for 76 against them. So far this season, Buffalo has allowed 14 for 191 and a touchdown to slot wide receivers. You may be asking yourself why I'm talking all about slot receivers, because Robert Woods isn't a slot receiver. Well, that's the point. This matchup screams slot wide receiver Cooper Kupp and tight end Tyler Higbee, but unfortunately, I think that may come at the expense of Robert Woods' upside in his fantasy day overall. Thus, wide receiver 6 is just a bit too high for me in week 3, and I hate to do it, but I got to sell.
God, this was one that I was really debating on whether or not I want to go out on a limb and buy, but that WR6 price tag just leaves so little room for error. You know, I think, man, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna buy Robert Woods. I know you said the slot receiver. Maybe it is a week that, you know, he's not as involved this week, but you know, I'm going to go with the talent. I'm going to go with the risk, and I'm going to say Robert Woods balls out this week and gets in the end zone. They've been manufacturing carries for him out of the backfield. They're a little banged up in the backfield, so yeah, what the heck? You know, this is I'm opening the door. This is your guys' chance to take up a couple games on me.
Well, I think we're going to get this one on you then, Jay, because it's, for me, I mean, wide receiver 6 is pretty steep. You have to put up a really nice game. And that's not saying Robert Woods isn't capable of it, but, you know, he'll have probably Tre'Davious White on him, and that's going to be a relatively tough matchup. And, you know, he's probably going to need to get in the end zone to hit that mark, and Robert Woods doesn't do that a whole lot in the last season plus now. So, yeah, I can't do it. Wide receiver 6. I love Robert Woods, but I'm going to go ahead and have to sell him here. I see him like being more in that wide receiver 2 range, and certainly not in the top 6 this week.
Yes, sir. Better days will be ahead for Robert Woods, though. Don't worry about it. Next up, another sell we've got this week is Minnesota Vikings wide receiver Adam Thielen. Again, home versus Tennessee today at 1 p.m. Tennessee's the 3-point favorite with an over-under 49.5. The aggregate projection for Adam Thielen this week is wide receiver 10. Total Foresight is selling that pretty hard and currently has him as wide receiver 20, partially because he has the second worst wide receiver strength of schedule this week. And that O-line in Minnesota has given up 5 sacks, tied for 10th most allowed. And when you look at their opposing defense in week 1, Tennessee only allowed 1 wide receiver, Jerry Jeudy, with 59 yards to eclipse 30 receiving yards. In week 2, the Jags wide receivers had a bit more success, but not to the point of wide receiver 10. Cole was wide receiver 17 and Shark was wide receiver 34. I know this in this low volume offense, Thielen has to absolutely maximize his 8 targets per game. I will not at all be surprised if those who rostered Thielen look back and wish they would have sold high after week 1, because I just don't know if he has another game like that in him this season in this offense right now. I could certainly be wrong, but I feel like the Titans are going to smash this week. I'm selling Dalvin. I'm selling Thielen. I'm just selling this whole team in week 3. I mean, Thielen only mustered 3 for 31 last week. In this offense, that can absolutely happen anytime, every week.
That's absolutely true. Week 1, they were home against the Packers, and he balled out. Last week, they played a good defense, and he struggled mightily. This week, they're at home against a good defense, so which way is it going to go? I'm going to go out on a limb, and I'm going to buy Adam Thielen again. You know, that team's going to have to move the ball. Their backs are against the wall. They're hearing it from the media. They're hearing it from the fans. You know, they're not playing up to what people expected, so they got to do something. They got to come out and play. That offense looks putrid. They know it. We know it. They got to come out and do something. And the only guy on that offense outside of Dalvin Cook who is going to catch balls at a high clip is Adam Thielen. So I'm going to bank that he has a big week this week. And like I said, I'm going out on a limb. I'm going to buy Adam Thielen as wide receiver 10. It's a mistake, and I admit it. And here you go, guys. The door is wide open.
Mike Vrabel thinks that's very cute, and they're going to be hearing it from the Vikings. Are going to be hearing it from Mike Vrabel today.
Yep.
Yeah.
Believe it or not, I actually am going to buy Adam Thielen as well. And for some of the, I mean, I'm definitely skeptical.
Oh,
but I just think that Kirk Cousins coming off like that's just a tragic game. He needs to lean on the best option that he has in that passing game, and Adam Thielen has the talent to do it. And Tennessee, I know they haven't been burned by wide receivers the first 2 weeks, but they are really banged up in their secondary. So, Thielen, he might be able to take advantage of that. So, I figured, I'm looking down the list and I'm like, man, if I'm going to try to disagree somewhere with somebody, this is probably my best shot.
Yes.
So, I'll go ahead and I'll buy Adam Thielen at wide receiver 10 for this week.
All right, Ben, this is your chance to get back in it, climb back up. Let's go.
Yep. Me and Total Foresight on the same page all day this week.
Yeah, and no surprise here. I'm selling the last two before we even get to them.
That's fine. And the first sell the Jay's referring to is Tampa Bay Buccaneers tight end Rob Gronkowski. The Bucs are on the road at Denver today at 425. The Bucs are a 6-point favorite, have an over-under of 43. It's going to be clear in 63 weather-wise, so that's not going to be an issue. The reason that Rob Gronkowski is on this podcast today is because his aggregate projection is still tight end 15. I was wrong about Gronk. I was expecting big things coming into the season. It took me a very short amount of time to pivot off of that. Total Foresight is selling with a tight end 17 rank for him this week. He's got the 6th best tight end strength of schedule, though. But when you look at their offensive line, they have given up 3 sacks. That's tied for the 13th fewest. When you look at their opposing defense, it doesn't matter. You know why? Because per rotoworld.com on Thursday, Bruce Arians came out and said straight up that Gronk was brought in primarily to be a blocker. Okay. Oh, maybe that's just coach speak. But on Friday, Gronk confirmed it and said he was surprised he's seen a whopping 4 targets in 2 weeks because he thought he'd see less. So can someone please explain to me why he's projected to finish just 1 slot behind Jonnu Smith? I couldn't have been more wrong about what it meant when Gronk followed Tom to Tampa Bay, and I've admitted that, adapted, and move on. But for whoever is still projecting him as tight end 15, they clearly have not. Sell, and drop.
Amen. I have nothing to add. I no. Jump off if you haven't jumped off the bandwagon yet, 1, I don't know why you're on it to begin with, and 2, leap off. Get off that thing before it goes off the cliff.
I'm sure he might catch a few touchdowns throughout the entirety of 2020, but you're never going to just put him in your lineup and be praying for that to happen.
Yeah,
so,
you can't bet on that. Yeah,
that's the only way any of us are wrong selling Gronkowski on any given week, is if he catches, 1 ball for 8 yards and a touchdown, and that just weasels him right into that top 15. But
and it's going to be this week.
It very well could be. But
yeah, they're trying to pull a Kansas City shuffle on us and make everybody look left and go right.
And that's the thing too, is on the road at Denver. The way Denver's played against tight ends, it's not it's not a terrible matchup, but it's not a great one either. So even that doesn't scream for any reason to have faith in something so unlikely occurring this week. So I have to sell.
Perfect. And we already know Jay is in agreement with our next Total Foresight sell, talking about Indianapolis Colts tight end Jack Doyle. Colts are at home versus the hapless New York Jets. Indy is an 11.5-point favorite with an over-under of 45.5. Obviously, they're in a dome in Indy, so it doesn't matter about the weather. The aggregate projection for Jack Doyle is tight end 17. Total Foresight is selling him emphatically. We currently have him as tight end 27. He does have the 11th ranked tight end strength of schedule. And that O-line has just given up 2 sacks, which is tied for 4th fewest allowed. But again, with the opposing defense, it doesn't matter. At rotoworld.com, head coach Frank Reich said Doyle is, quote, ready to roll. And it's expected that Mo Alley Cox is to be faded for Doyle's benefit. Well, I'm just going to say here and now in my best Ron Burgundy impression, I don't believe you. There's no way that this team is going to fade that beast, Mo Alley Cox, for an oft-injured Jack Doyle with a gimpy ankle. So tight end 17 for Doyle, for me, I'm selling. At best, I think he sees half his normal targets this week because, quite frankly, Mo Alley Cox earned more opportunities last week, plain and simple. It's a sell for me.
Well, and you know what? I agree with you. It shouldn't be that way. Maybe it will be. Maybe Jack Doyle steps right into his old role and Mo Alley Cox doesn't get on the field nearly as much, and we're all surprised by that and a little bit bewildered by it. But really, against that Jets defense, I just don't expect them to have to throw the ball a ton. They're not going to have to sling that rock around. They should be able to run the ball, control the game script, and just ride out a nice win for themselves. And I just don't think the volume's going to be huge. Maybe he does get in the end zone and prove us wrong. It certainly could be the case, and he should get some catches at least. But, boys, tight end 17, and he is back as a starter. Man, I don't like it. I'm going to sell it and go with Total Foresight.
Wanted you to buy.
No, I think it's just a game script thing. That Jets defense is just atrocious. The Jets in general are a dumpster fire, and like I said, I just don't think the volume's going to be there.
Yeah, and that's a really good point that you made, Jay, because I too was a little bit on the fence with this one, just knowing like Phillip Rivers' propensity to want to throw to tight ends and that the receiving core, they're definitely knocked down a peg right now. And I'm like, well, there could be enough for both of those guys to get targets.
Sure.
But then it's like, well, duh, they have Jonathan Taylor and they're playing the Jets, who we just saw get carved up by San Francisco on the ground. So, it just stands to reason, like take the path of least resistance. And, that I don't think Phillip Rivers has to throw the ball that much, and that Doyle, he's not going to get the targets that can, surpass him being tight end 17 without, once again, as I think it goes for any of these kind of aggregate projections with tight ends, without a touchdown.
Right,
I
exactly.
don't see it being a possibility.
Yep.
So I'm going to sell it.
It's going to be interesting. You know what? Sorry, Ben. It's going to be interesting today to watch this game and see if Phillip Rivers can be more of a game manager and just guide them to an easy win versus doing what he normally does and unnecessarily spread the ball around and turn it over and keep the Jets in it.
And you stole my thunder, Jay. That was exactly the point I was going to make. I agree with Vegas and their favoring the Colts by 11.5, but I think that's going to most benefit Jonathan Taylor.
Yeah.
And like you said, that's going to equate to Phillip Rivers just managing the game, letting Jonathan Taylor feast. Don't turn the ball over. Don't lose it for us, Mr. Rivers. And, and just sit back and enjoy a nice win. And that's going to come at the detriment of a guy like Jack Doyle. And again, if this coaching staff has half a brain cell, you're going to keep giving Mo Alley Cox looks.
And maybe this is a game kind of like we saw in week 1 where Nyheim Hines has a bigger role and more of an impact. He should be getting some more balls out of the backfield because, again, they don't have to pass the ball downfield. Just gash them on the ground like Steve said. And maybe this is a game for both running backs to really cash in and shine this week.
All right. Well, hey, there wasn't too many. Jay, you disagreed with me in Total Foresight 3 times. Steve disagreed with me in Total Foresight 2 times. I am in lockstep with Total Foresight this week. Just 14 for 14. And you know what? That's, statistically season long, that's more often than not the best way to go. So hopefully the chalk has something for me this week. And now we have got a couple of nice little pieces left for you this week. We have got Steve's week 3 speculative stashes. If you've got some middling wide receiver 5 or 6 at the end of your bench, stay tuned to this list of players who could have the potential to, by virtue of themselves or one of their teammates getting injured or something like that, absolutely blow up this week and be the priority waiver ad heading into week 4. And then, he came up with a really great name for a concept we've really driven home for years on this podcast called the stash and dash strategy. So sit back and enjoy Steve's speculative stashes and his stash and draft strategy.
Thanks, Benny. And I'd say more than ever, keep at least one roster spot open if you can, just for stashing guys, because we've seen so many injuries and a lot of us have had to spend in different leagues a lot of fab already. So you're going to get to a point where it's like, you you really hope that you picked up guys before they're going to be out there and you have to get into a bidding war for them. Because we're going to see more and more injuries, and I could see a lot of teams just being out of fab like a quarter, worse, halfway into the season. So with that said, we'll get started. Have a handful of guys to go over. And I guess I'll start out with first and foremost, it's more of like a PSA and not necessarily one specific player, but for goodness sakes, if after week 2 you're not doing this, please start all backup insurance policy running backs. Like if they're a high value one and it's somebody else's starting running back, still grab them because there's going to be value there should their starter go down. And if it's somebody on your team, I mean, imagine if, for instance, you had Christian McCaffrey and just before kickoff, you're like, okay, I'll throw Mike Davis on. And the unthinkable happens and McCaffrey goes down. Well, at least you don't have to spend anything for Mike Davis on a 4-week rental or whatever it's going to be. But there are a lot of people, I've heard about people in some leagues putting up $450 of their, like 45% of their fab just for that 4-week rental. And that's brutal. And of course, by the time that 1 p.m. or by the time the Panthers are done playing, if CMC is unscathed, just drop him. So, and so that's what it's all about when it comes to those running backs, the backups. I understand we always don't have a roster spot available. Some leagues are deeper than others, but if you have a spot you can burn and turn, look at the best asset on your team that has a backup out there and just go pick them up for that game only. And if you get away without an injury, cool, drop them. So, and hey, Ben, before we move on to the first player I have, you mentioned a guy earlier, Darrington Evans, right? His first game, he's healthy. If you have Derrick Henry, why not before 1 p.m. kickoff, throw him at the end of your bench? Hey, so long as Henry gets pounded another 30 carries, doesn't get injured, then just drop him. So, but that's what it's all about with those backup running backs. Now, first guy I have on the list, Dalton Schultz, tight end of the Dallas Cowboys, as of publishing Thursday morning, was only rostered in 11% of all Yahoo leagues. Prescott, he's not going to be throwing the ball 47 times every week. They're not going to be in a matchup like they did with Atlanta every single week. So, I don't think we're going to count on Schultz seeing 10 targets every single week. But he did catch 9 of them for 88 yards and a touchdown. And out of the tight end position, that is a phenomenal week of production. And, for a guy that's only rostered in 11% of leagues, if you have a spot, why not stash him? I mean, the matchup actually is pretty good against Seattle. We're projecting that to be a very high scoring affair. But see what his usage is like once again. I mean, for all the reasons that people were really into Blake Jarwin, you should still be into Dalton Schultz at this point in time. So stash him. And if we have back-to-back weeks where he's seeing 7-8 targets once again, then I think you have something. So certainly worth throwing at the end of your bench, see what he does this week. And I have to, I won't say too much about my boy Drew Sample, but he is on this list. It's still only rostered in 3% of leagues. And again, with how bad Cincinnati's defense is, they can't get pressure. They're just going to get scorched all season long by any competent offenses. And we're going to see Joe Burrow continue to put up probably some relatively insane passing attempt numbers for a rookie quarterback. And with all of that volume, and he clearly has a comfort level targeting the tight end position. I mean, 21% of his targets have gone there the first 2 weeks. Again, second round pedigree guy. See what happens this week. Philadelphia is a relatively friendly matchup for tight ends. Like we talked about, you could plug and play him if you had to out of desperation, but see what he does this week in a full game of action being the tight end on that offense. And maybe he's somebody that a lot of people are running to pick up next week at the tight end position. And just got 2 wide receivers for us, and I'll start out with Chase Claypool, wide receiver of the Pittsburgh Steelers, only rostered in 8% of leagues. This is someone who's definitely, a stash. You're not going to, even in desperation, you really don't want to have to put him out there. He's only seen 5 targets in the first 2 weeks of the NFL season. And he's a rookie wide receiver. They tend to come along a little slowly in offenses. But out of those 5 targets, he has caught all 5 of them for 127 yards and a touchdown. So, you see, even with that limited opportunity, he has really shined with it. And we haven't seen now, like James Washington, I don't think is a thing and is going to be a thing for this Pittsburgh Steelers offense. He's in his third year now, and he's only seen 8 targets himself. He's only caught 5 of them for 56 yards. So where I could see Claypool being valuable is in the event that Deontay Johnson is injured or Juju Smith-Schuster is injured, that you'd be happy to have that guy, because I think Big Ben would start relying on him pretty heavily too, like we're kind of seeing out of Deontay Johnson and Juju. They're kind of like the 1A and 1B. And, it hasn't really amounted to anything yet. And, it seems more like maintenance days than anything. But, Juju and Deontay, they've both been, just a little dinged up already this early in the season. And we've seen Smith-Schuster miss time more often than we'd like to have seen him so far in his NFL career. So that's kind of why I like him, just because he's looked good and he's readily available. And then another guy I have at wide receiver, KJ Hamler, wide receiver of the Denver Broncos, rostered in only 2% of leagues as of Thursday morning. It's probably been changing with I haven't seen the latest on Jerry Jeudy, but last I saw he could be a game time decision with his rib injury. But KJ missed a lot of camp, had a hamstring that was lingering, finally made his NFL debut last week, had 3 grabs for 48 yards, tied for the team league with 7 targets. They gave him a rushing attempt too. And, they've already come out in Denver and said, we need to find ways to get this guy the ball. You have no more Cortland Sutton. Jerry Jeudy might be dealing with something. So, for a guy that was just shy of a double-digit PPR game last week, you could see his opportunity going up. And he's an explosive player, could take any given touch that he gets to the house. He's worth, to me, this is the best kind of spec stash, because he's only rostered in such a small percentage of leagues. You can go out there and throw him at the end of your bench and just see if he pops off. I mean, I know it's Jeff Driscoll at quarterback, but I mean, hey, I didn't think Drew Lock was all that impressive anyways. And Driscoll's willing to sling it around a little bit. He put up some numbers against Pittsburgh. So, hey, throw him at the end of your bench, see what happens. And some of the reason I kind of also targeted Claypool and Hamler is because it's kind of a good example for, Ben introduced a little earlier in the podcast, what I like to call stash and dash. And that's literally, and you can really start it with your Thursday night matchup, but you keep that one roster spot open in your lineup, and you find guys that for each of the games throughout Thursday night, Sunday at 1, Sunday at 4, Sunday night, that if if it's not worth keeping the guy, drop him, look at the matchup, see who's available in your league, and just keep stashing. And then, I just think stash and dash sounds catchy. So, but you're basically stashing, dropping, and just doing your thing. And all of these are obviously low odds of hitting on, but if you just keep doing it week after week, you eventually hit some guys. And
well, Steve, real quick, I don't mean to interrupt, but you've alluded to it before. It makes watching everything from Thursday through Sunday and Monday that much more fun, because like Steve just said, it's the equivalent of playing slot machines or a dollar scratch off lottery ticket for every single game, because it's a very low risk, high reward, easy pivot. But every once in a while you hit that jackpot, and now all of a sudden you got the next week's top waiver ad for free because of your propensity to stash and dash.
And I mean, even in our own league of record, the 4 p.m. games on that initial Sunday of the season, I just went out and I'm like, okay, I'm going to throw Joshua Kelly at the end of my bench, see what happens. Now that's a guy that I'm flexing this week as a starter on my roster. So,
that's how I ended up with James Robinson, man.
Yeah, So it doesn't always happen that way, but you have to give yourself the chance. And, in the situation of Chase Claypool, that's a 1 p.m. game. Unless it goes into overtime, that game's over. You didn't start him, so he's on your bench, so he's going to be droppable. Okay, well, I'll drop Chase Claypool and go pick up KJ Hamler, because that's a 4:25 p.m. game. KJ has a nice game. Sweet, I'll hang on to him. I'm going to keep him as a potential valuable piece for my bench or potential flex guy down the line. Or, he's a dud. Okay, I'm going to drop him. Okay, we have the Saints and Packers playing Thursday or Sunday night. Is there anybody available in my league that might be worth a stash there? And you just keep doing that. So again, I kind of dislike the fact that there's some guys in our league listening, because there's going to be more and more people doing this now, and this is kind of like my thing, butter, that I've tried doing throughout the
They
year.
all have short attention spans, Steve-O. Don't worry about it. They all stop listening.
But yeah, so stash and dash, everybody. Do it all the time, as often. If your league doesn't make you pay for transactions, there is no harm and no foul on just picking up and dropping guys all day, every day.
Amen.
Yes, sir. And before we get out of here, just want to make sure we just cover a few things that have come out within the last couple of hours that you might want to know heading into the week. First, it looks like and this is all per rotoworld.com. Michael Thomas ankle is looking to return in week 4. Kenny Galladay hamstring is expected to play today in week 3. Duke Johnson ankle is a long shot for week 3. And man, couple hours ago, there was a scare. The Falcons and Bears games might not have happened. There was a cornerback for the Falcons that hit the COVID positive list. Luckily, they have cleared everybody else in the facility, but there was apparently a question. I was like, oh my God, that game might not happen. What's going on? But all is well. No worries there. And Raiders tight end Darren Waller is good to go for week 3. Josh Jacobs' hip is expected to play in week 3 as well. Julio Jones, quote, outlook is a little bleak for week 3. So this is one of those situations where, man, as somebody who has Julio rostered as my wide receiver 1, please just sit him, get him right, let him come back and have a league-winning week next week, please. Don't trot him out there to be a decoy and have him strain something else. Thank you. And lastly, at least for now, as of 11:07 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, the last thing that came out was that Deebo Samuel is, quote, likely to return in week 5. So keep all that on your radar. There's definitely some more game time decisions out there that you want to stay on top of heading into 1 p.m. kickoff time. But man, great episode. Tons of information in less than an hour and 10 minutes. Good stuff, guys. Anybody got anything else before we get out of here?
Let's go get some wins. I'm excited to cash in on some accuracy this week. It's redemption week. It's here.
I'm right there with you guys. I'm just pumped for the next hour and 52 minutes to go by.
Absolutely. I woke up feeling dangerous this morning with these buys and sells. Hopefully our quarterback Baker Mayfield did as well. Yes, sir. And, let's, like Jay said, let's go get some wins. Let's go be really accurate. Let's have a fun, remotely injury-free type of fantasy week, please. We got all the injuries out of the way last week, and everybody keep being smart about your COVID so we don't lose any games because, we just got a nice little reminder of how easy that is to happen. So enjoy your football today, enjoy your football tonight, enjoy your football Monday night, and we will be back with you Tuesday night at 8 p.m. to review everything that went on in week 3 and tell you who to target on the waiver wire heading into week 4. Can't wait.
And that wraps up this episode of Fantasy Foresight, the podcast. We thank you for joining us. Be sure to visit us, as always, at fantasyforesight.com. Use the links at the bottom of the page to find us across social media, including Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and wherever you pod. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and we'll see you next time.
You guys, I'm